If this century went well, the core issue would be meaning. What can we believe in? What is the meaning of life? Maintain, I think, a double focus on how the world perceives what you're doing and how you perceive what you're doing, and keep them in some balance. The reason to talk is not to convince anybody of anything, but to stimulate their imagination. As soon as you see that you've done that, guess what? It's time to shut up.
Welcome to Pensive Series. This is the second part of the interview with Dr. Carmichael. If you haven't listened to the first part, I encourage you to go back and listen to the first episode. Otherwise, enjoy. What kind of advice would you give your younger self?
Well, I get asked this a lot by young people. What should I study? Should I be like you?
And what do you say usually?
The world I grew up in is really different. It was much easier. Much easier. The very fact that I could earn my way through school without any debt, just totally on my own, that's unheard of today practically. Some people do it, but not many. You have to either start a company or have a rock band or something. So I would say you probably want to do stuff where you look good from society's point of view, but that it makes sense to you in your own judgment. Mm-hmm. And that knowing some combination of technical stuff and the humanities, kind of Steve Jobs one, I think is key. And I would say to a young person, take some risks, try journalism as on top of what you're doing. Whatever you're doing, write for some publication. Get out there and do it. Travel really hard these days because, for one thing, everywhere you go looks the same. Travel's been very important to me, but the things that I loved in travel are gone. For example, I was in New Delhi in the mid-'80s, which to me was not that long ago. Half the traffic in the street was elephants, bullocks, and the cars and the bicycles would go in between. There weren't that many cars. It's all gone. Oh, yeah, one thing that I do say to young people is make sure whatever you do, you get some anthropology and archaeology and art history. Those three things. Because they're the disciplines that have maintained some integrity about the core compared to others. Mm-hmm. Literature theory, forget it. It's terrible. Read books, read literature, but don't get too caught up in theory. Because you'll learn to talk in a dead way about living things. It's not good for you. Yeah. Archaeology is fantastic. It really gives it perspective.
And how do you sort of maintain a focus when you want to keep doing all these things? So how can you become the Renaissance man, but still become really good at something?
I'd say, look, you've got to maintain, I think, a double focus on how the world perceives what you're doing and how you perceive what you're doing, and keep them in some balance. You've got to maintain your health. You've got to eat. You've got to sleep someplace. You've got to be thinking out a little bit as to where your generation is going and where you want to be in it. All legitimate, but try and maintain flexibility. For example, I'm often meeting with people who are consultants, and they'll say, "Oh, I read all the time." So what do you read? The Guru in 12 Steps, How to Be a Management Expert in 3 Weeks, right? That's what they read.
Yeah.
Useless. It's worse than useless. If I say to a management person, I say, look, you spend a lot of time in X industry. What do you know about the history of that industry? What? They have no idea.
If you were sort of a millennial now, how would you think about the future? And you have this really interesting sort of framework about how the world works. And sort of, what are some things you would not do at all?
I'm going to pick up on your putting the word millennials in and the future. My personal view is that not only is the century about meaning, but lived life, is going to be a lot about caring for each other. I think we're going to be surrounded by people who are really hurting as a result of wars, migrations, bankruptcies, disease. We're in a perfect storm. It's a really difficult situation. Basically, the rich have stolen the world. For one thing, I'd say, look, if you don't know what to do something, because it'll turn out it's meaningful, even though you don't think that, but just keep doing something. Maybe the thing in the future is going to be we're going to have another French Revolution, and the pitchfork factory is going to be the place of the best career. I think it's a time of turmoil. Another thing I think is really worth studying, but we're making a long list, is architecture. I think the spirit in architecture is because it's building the world, and we don't have much of a design sense. Knowing that, like Frederick Law Olmsted, do you know that name? Did Central Park, did the Stanford.
Oh, yeah, Stanford, yeah.
Did everything. He did the Boston fence.
But doesn't that require sort of, going back to what Thiel said about sort of requires sort of a definite sense of the future and being optimistic about the future? Because design is all about having the vision of how the future looks like and then encouraging other people to implement that vision.
Well, I think however bad the future is, there's always will be better things to do. That is, maybe we got to figure out how to bury a lot of people. Let's be smart about it. I don't know. That's part of the problem. We know, but the more you know, the better. And focus. See, somebody like Peter wants to hire people who have a focus. Why don't they want to hire him? Right? I mean, why should we all get smart so we compete with each other so Peter Thiel can hire us at half the salary we used to get because we're competing with each other?
But I think to be fair to Thiel, he always says, how can you be more successful without competing more, right? So, yeah, it's a difficult debate.
I mean, success in a world where the basic model is concentration of wealth going on in every job, every business, every bank, maybe pulling back a little and doing things that are more interesting personally and not worrying too much about the success, except to at least survive. And that takes effort. And it takes more effort now than it used to. But the whole idea of success...
what is success for you?
What is success for me?
Yeah.
My mind goes to two places. Surviving another day and being good to friends and enjoying things. But not blinking at the harsher realities. Be willing to look at them. And that's hard. I mean, I do this stuff with INET. And, they want to be successful economists. And the idea of talking about, a big issue in my mind for INET is, come on, guys, growth, you're kidding. Growth ruins the environment. Do you want to do that? Can we talk about both issues at the same time instead of having growth in one room and the environment in another one? We've got to do better than that. And then we're going to add in that there are no jobs. And if you think we can go green and create a lot of neat green jobs, because a lot of the smart guys are building machines to do all of agriculture. There are no jobs in green. So we're up against it. Now let's talk. Can we talk now? But they won't do it.
What can one individual do?
No, it's like you go out and you watch beavers make a dam or ants make an anthill.
Right.
The process is interesting to watch. Being in a society is interesting. Watch it with a certain degree of detachment. Enter in when compassion is at stake, like I say, when people are hurting and they need your help. But don't take on that you have to cure the whole thing. It can't. And in fact, we might be, at the time of watching it, really get in deep, deep trouble. In which case, you want to stay alive and help people.
How do you consume sort of news? Because it seems like there's so many things. People used to just read one newspaper. Now they have access to so much media and so many different newspapers from all over the world. So I'm just curious, sort of when you wake up and you want to understand what's going on in the world, how do you sort of consume media?
Actually, if you went to a library or a men's club in 1900, there are newspapers from all over the world on these wooden things stuck in racks. You might have seen those somewhere.
Yeah.
And like John F. Kennedy, every day reads the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, the Financial Times, and something else. I know people. So the idea that there's more now and it's easier, I think, is an illusion. And the illusion is it's so easy to pop around from thing to thing that, in fact, one is not doing a very good job of getting into anything.
But surely these things back in the day, not many people had access to these things. And now with the internet, everyone has access to sort of all these things.
The average sentence in the New York Times today is half of what it was in 1960. And the amount of stuff in it, it used to be compendious, a single issue. First of all, it was 8 columns wide. The page was half again as wide as it is now. There were 40 pages, and there were articles from every country in the world. Now, say Cameroon. What do you know about what's going on in the Cameroon? Unless you're very special, nothing. So I don't think we're reading very well. We're not using the information. Back to the question, what do I do? My wife gets the New York Times and the local Press Democrat, which is actually one of the best local papers in the country. It has real news. You can figure out what's going on in the city council and what the developers are doing, and it's good. She reads them. I look at the front page just to get a gestalt, what's happened. But for the most part, I figured out a long time ago that time spent reading a book will have more news in it than reading the news. And especially novels. I'm just finishing a novel on the South in the 1820s plantation, a young girl who, in her sensitivity, really rebels against the slavery. And there's a tremendous amount of detail. You could read the New York Times for 10 years and never get as much stuff. I used to do a summary of the Sunday New York Times online in the mid-'80s, try and figure out what technology that was. And so I would read it and then take the key articles and look at them and write summaries of what they were about and comments by me. And it took me not very long to realize that the book section had the view that the world was pretty screwed up, except for a couple of good things. And the news section was the reverse. All these interesting things are happening, but some things are screwed up. Really, the gestalt reverse. And that you learned a lot more about the world by reading the book section of the New York Times than by reading the news section. And
that's interesting.
So, okay, take that seriously. So that's one of the reasons why I read a lot of history. I'm reading a book now on the shift from the Ming Empire to the Manchus, 1620 in China. It's incredible on what happens when a society breaks down. And I think it's really helpful in understanding some of what we might have to go through. And so anyway, these are some of the things. I spend usually 3 days a week in Palo Alto, and I know a lot of people, and I run some groups that talk about. I get a lot of input from people.
Sort of like Benjamin Franklin did with the Junto Society.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
About the groups?
Yeah.
Well, there are two. One has been going for 4 years. I probably should give some background to this. In consulting, I approached it as a psychoanalyst. That is, what do you guys want to do and what's in the way? As I would have that, rather than trying to tell them. So it was always a kind of inquiry. And then I brought the scenario work into it and got pretty convinced that the scenario people pretty much spent too much time on the future and they didn't look at the past. So I started thinking about how to do that. Then at Stanford, a colleague of mine and I created a thing called the Stanford Strategy Studio, which was experiments in how to have more intelligent adult conversations. Take, for example, you go to a second grade classroom and the teacher has the wall filled with interesting things to look at. You go to a conference room for adults, the walls are blank, the lights are too bright, people are drinking Coke out of cans or coffee out of plastic cups. That is, it's a throwaway society. And they've got a PDF they haven't read, and we think they're going to be smart. No way. So we experimented with all these parameters. And I learned a great deal from it. Did that for 4 years. And that led to then bringing clients into this space, organizations that were in some kind of trouble, so it became more experiments. And out of it, I started a group that was, to me, kind of the embodiment of what I thought we had learned in some aspects, because they're different things. And this group, which we call Serious Conversations, which is slightly funny, and it's mostly pretty senior Silicon Valley types, people who run small software companies, hardware companies, from the university, venture capitalists, people like that. And we meet every Wednesday night, and we sit in a circle, and the first rule is no agenda allowed. Drives them nuts. And we mean no agenda. What's our deliverable? How long do we have? And we go around the room, and each person says what's been on their mind that they think is most worthy of a serious conversation. No comments from anybody else. We just finish the circle. So we go all the way around, usually about 15 people. By the time you're done, the atmosphere is so rich, it's just awesome in itself. And then we start the conversation. And the key thing is never talk as an expert. Talk as a person. And I might have to say something like, the reason to talk is not to convince anybody of anything, but to stimulate their imagination. As soon as you see that you've done that, guess what? It's time to shut up. Otherwise, you'll ruin the very thing you created. So we do that, and it's an amazing group. People are deeply committed to it, in some ways even more than I am, which is interesting. And people come from Berkeley and San Francisco every week to come to this thing. I can't believe it. It's amazing. So that group has been just extraordinary, and it talks about really deep stuff. And people learn how to do it. They learn how to listen and to hear what's developing in themselves that they've never thought before, rather than coming out with pre-digested opinions. I run another group, which in some ways is the exact opposite. It's basically, what the fuck do we do now? Okay. Right? I mean, it's the model is, where are we at this historical time? How did we get here? Everything's up for grabs, like Western civilization, or how we got from Christianity to economics. How's that for a shift in scenario? And what are plausible futures? That group is a much more difficult group because, in a way, it demands that people really know stuff. The first group doesn't.
Mm.
In the first group, people have their experience. They can talk about that. There's a lot to say, and it goes really well. But the one about where are we and how do we get here and where are we going, people just don't know very much. And they're filled with generalities. For example, everything must be okay because GDP in the world is going up. Well, no, wait a minute. Let's take any country. Pick one. What's happening there? You have an elite that's getting richer and richer very fast. You average that with a bottom that's getting poorer, and you come up with a GDP is going up. Give me a break. And there are lots. Another one is people leave the countryside to go to the new opportunities in the city. Total bullshit.
Mm.
People leave the country because the military forces them off because agribusiness is taking over the land. People don't know that stuff. And they're not interested in knowing it because it makes them uncomfortable. So it's a much harder conversation. 2 weeks ago, I took an experiment. I said, look, let's start out with the idea that we know it's all going to fall apart. It's a total mess. Now, if we start with that assumption, can we find holes in it? Turned out to be really, really good. We've been doing that for 3 weeks now. Much better discussion. And one of the things that was striking, I thought it would create a lot of anxiety, is in the conversation talking about the worst things, like millions dying in migration wars because of climate change. The atmosphere in the room got more positive and you might almost say happier. Why? Because the taboo had been broken and people felt such relief to be able to talk about it. That was really impressive to me. I did not expect it.
Is there anything you do to stimulate your own imagination?
Well, I think every day does that. But if you look at it in terms of a learning process, a key one probably is being a psychoanalyst, because you learn to show up hour after hour listening to people talk about their stories.
How did that help you to see sort of the world from another person's, viewpoint? We're often stuck in our own worldview. So I was just curious, through what you mentioned, how did it help you to sort of see the world not just through your own eyes, but through the eyes of other people?
Well, I think it's a really good question. To me, most people do not know what they think and what their own assumptions and what their mind is. So I'm sitting there trying to help them discover what they think. And in doing that, if I get my thoughts in the way, it screws up the whole process. It's like trying to teach somebody to paint and coming in with a paintbrush and painting on top of their paint. It doesn't work. It's their discovery. Now, if all they did was talk about what they already think and know, you wouldn't get anywhere. But in fact, they don't know. They don't know what they believe, what they think. So learning how to have that kind of discussion is a fabulous education. I think it's wonderful work. Part of the problem in the world now is psychoanalysis is basically dead. It's too time-consuming. It's too expensive.
Yeah.
And the analysts are badly taught. I mean, it's part of the whole conundrum of the failure of education to be human.
But what sort of things are you optimistic about looking forward? Maybe also about education.
No. Things like the Khan Academy are trying to teach people for jobs that are disappearing. It's taking on all this debt. It's because they're terrified they're going to miss out. So they get in deep debt in order to prepare for a job that's going to be gone.
Well, going back sort of to when you mentioned your daily rituals or habits, so one thing you said sort of was that you rise early and the benefit that comes from that. Is there sort of anything else that you do on on a regular basis, it is something like that. It gives you sort of these kinds of benefits.
Well, I've worked out a kind of rhythm which goes sort of like this. It's going to sound too programmatic, but it's what I do. So I read some news and some other stuff in the morning, have breakfast. First thing, get up. I run for a little bit, a couple 100 yards. It's an amazing way to wake up. And you're out in the air. It's kind of like back to the newspaper thing.
Yeah.
There's birds and nobody's here, and it's beautiful. And I come back, turn on the coffee machine, and get in the hot tub. This is California, right? Look up at dawn coming. And so read a little bit of the news. Then I try and read something else. And it depends. If I did what I really wanted, I'd probably just read in other languages, French and Italian, primarily. So I get up about 6:30, more or less. But I use the light. I never use an alarm clock. So now it's beginning to get a little earlier. A couple weeks ago it was a little later. From 9 to 12, I write.
Every day?
No, I try, yeah. No interruptions. That's why I put you at 1 o'clock rather than at 11. And I have to get clear the night before what the writing is going to be, or I'll screw up in the morning. So I have to clear focus. Okay, I'll do that. So I'll spend the 3 hours on a writing project, which might include some reading if I need to do it to understand what I'm trying to write about. But I try and keep it mostly to writing, on the idea that getting out my own ideas is more important than reading somebody else's.
Is that so? The writing, does that also involve journaling?
No, I do that in other parts of the day. Then lunch. Then, depending upon the time of the season, like in the winter when it gets dark early, because I paint, I usually paint after lunch, 45 minutes, more or less.
And do you also know what you're going to paint about?
Well, actually, no. I just go. I paint where I am, whatever's there. Okay. So I have lots of paintings of the garden. It's kind of like Monet's garden.
Interesting.
Then I take a short nap, 10 minutes. I'm really good at a 10-minute nap. Get up really refreshed. Into the garden. I've got a great garden. And
so the nap, is that your sort of type of meditation?
No, I just try and let everything go. It's not a meditation. It's to disconnect your dreaming from your body. So you want to be totally still. Don't move a muscle. Because if you do, your cerebellum picks up on it and wants to figure out what the hell's going on. So the garden. And the garden is a big education. And it's something that I write about a lot and think about. On my website, there's a draft of a book called Garden World Politics, which is related to the garden.
We talked about sort of what kind of books you like and what kind of things you appreciate. Is there any, like, if there had to be like one thing that you would tell a young person to read or to do, like just one specific thing?
I don't think I have a good answer to that question. I've said this in the past. I said, look, who do you think are the most interesting writers and intellectuals? And they'll say, well, about Shakespeare, Dante, whatever. Do you read them? You think they're the most interesting. Why not? That's who you should read. Be prepared to change your mind. Yeah. But for now, take the people you already think are the most interesting and read them very carefully.
And then, obviously, your thinking has evolved. So, like, the way now the world works, what would you have done differently in the past to be more effective and to, like, do things more effectively?
What would I do to be more effective?
Yeah, and for whatever sort of you care about or want to do. And this could be personal things. It doesn't have to be on a societal level.
Write popular songs and make movies.
And why movies?
Because they have such an impact on people's perceptions.
Yeah.
I mean, take a film like The Matrix or The Truman Show. Our modern sense of how screwed up we are for many, many people is created by those films. They're incredible.
Thank you for listening, and see you next time.